Wow, Ruth, you born and raised a superstar kid. We all want that. What are some of the philosophies in raising him?
Well, I was a single mother, and I was always very worried about my son. What would happen to him if I died or something happened to me? So I really raised him to be pretty resilient and self-sufficient. I was kind of a tough love mom. I want him to earn it. And when he'd say to me things are hard, I'd say, "Yep, things are hard.
Yeah.
Things are hard out there. You have to kind of, you know, grab what you want the world, work for it, work real hard for it." And he became very ambitious at a very young age. He saw how I struggled financially and at my work, and he was a good kid, so he wanted to help me. But he also really got the message pretty early in life that it's tough. It's tough not to have money. So he wanted to make good money and to be successful.
Was that hard for you raising him on your own? How did you handle that?
It was some tough times. There were some very tough times, actually, especially in the beginning. I was really fortunate because I had good friends. I had that village that Hillary Clinton refers to that to help me raise him because his father wasn't around. Um, my parents had disowned me because my son was black, and they weren't happy about that. Um, and um, his grandparents on the other side had already passed away, so it was really just us. And it was scary. But this was a good time in terms of where we were living. There were a lot of other single parents. So I made a lot of connections with people.
Mhm.
And that's a lot of what got us through those times.
It's interesting because in this day and age, there's so much just on your phone and not in person. And it sounds like a lot of the connections that were made were personal and people who were in Robert's life and not just texting or.
Yeah, and that was a very conscious choice on my part. I was very careful, very intentional about who I invited into our lives. I Because he didn't have a father, I wanted him to have strong male role models.
Yeah.
That were not people I was involved with romantically, but who were my friends. Because I made good friendships and solid ones, and I wanted whoever we were involved with to stay in our lives and not be subject to the turbulence of romantic relationships. And that helped a lot. Another thing was that I had started this preschool. So I had a preschool in my house downstairs for the first floor. So that's where he went to school. And so we were surrounded by other families. It was easy for me to make connections, and I worked at it.
Was that intentional that you had a preschool thinking that you could have a closer eye on him, or was it just sort
No,
of.
I started the school well before he was born, actually. Um, I started the school, what was it, at least 6 years before he was born. Yeah, 6 years before he was born. And I actually, the funny thing is that since I'd worked with children for those years, I thought I knew what I was getting into having a kid. Of course, I learned very quickly that teaching kids is not the same thing as having one. So that was a big shock.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What are some of the lessons that you took away from running that nursery school?
Well, this was a particular time in our history in Berkeley. It was Berkeley, California. I started the school in 1973. More people, more women were at work. There was more need for childcare. There was more of an understanding that early child education was a very important thing for kids. The Head Start programs had already started.
Right.
Um, it just really understood that giving kids that head start was important. And I had gotten my early childhood credential, and I thought I'd be a teacher in the public school system. But there were no jobs that year. For some reason, there was a glut of teachers in California that year. I really don't know why, but um, a friend of mine and I had this idea to start this school and just do it ourselves. And we literally built it ourselves. It was just like I looked at the downstairs of my house. I went, oh, there's an entrance to the backyard. I can make,
Yeah.
there's a little kitchenette here. I can make this into a school. And we literally built the furniture ourselves, the children's furniture, and a loft. And I remember putting together the climbing structure that we put in the backyard. I mean, it was really a do-it-yourself thing. I think, I mean, our budget was in the hundreds, 9,000 to get the place started. And working with kids at that time for me was a very maturing experience. I had been living a less structured life up until then. Now I had a big responsibility, being there every morning at 7:30 because the parents had to go to work and drop their kids off at school.
And what I love is it's not like you went to business school and you learned how to run a business. What I love about you is it's like, I have an idea, I'm just going to do it and I'm going to figure it out. I mean, that's a true entrepreneur.
That's actually been me all my life. It's interesting because even before that, well, back in those days, people would sell, crafts and jewelry, different things on Telegraph Avenue in
Right.
Berkeley, and I did that before I even started the school. I always had my little businesses, some way of making a living that was a little different.
And did you ever think about, oh, this is going to be successful, this won't be successful, I'm nervous about it, or did you just dive in?
I would dive in. I mean, we didn't even know the word entrepreneur then. I wasn't thinking of myself as an entrepreneur.
Yeah.
I was thinking, oh, if I did this, maybe I can make a little money.
Yeah.
And I would just try it. I'll tell you, after I had my own school, fast forward a little bit, I ended up actually in this rural county in California. And it was a time in California when all of a sudden there was a lot of funding for rural childcare. And I was the only person in that whole county who'd ever done any early child education and had my own schools. I got the job of director of this Plumas County childcare foundation, and I had to find a location and design a childcare center. And I had, other than one that I built just because it was downstairs, I'd never done that before, but I just used what I knew then. I remember I'd got graph paper, and I'm like, okay, how much, just.
Yeah.
And I remember one of my coworkers says, how do you know how to do this? I said, I don't know how I know, but let's just do it.
Right.
And I think there was maybe more room for error then, so it was okay to just try.
Well, one of the things I love is so many people, I think, have a fear of failure, but there never seemed to be you're thinking about, I might actually fail at this.
I think what happens when you're a single parent is you don't have the luxury to be afraid of failing. You just have to get up every morning and do it. Do whatever it is you need to do. A lot of parents will ask me now because my son is successful, what was the secret? What did I do? And I said, I did what you do. I got up every morning. I gave him breakfast. I took him to school. You just live day by day. You try to get through the day, get everything done, make sure your kid is safe, healthy, well-fed, getting a good education. That was, I think, the most important thing for me, for him, to make sure he got a really good education. Because I felt that that's what got me through my life.
Right.
We had a lot of difficult times, but I had that really excellent education to back me up. And I think that's part of what made me feel I could figure things out. I always relied on my brain. Like, whenever I was in trouble or have a real serious problem, I go, think. Okay, what next?
So you put the value of education in your family for him. It sounds like you also had very clear expectations, just the resiliency and saying you're going to do well at this. Was that a piece of it?
It was, I think, less expectations than sheer terror that he, where I just taught him from a very young age, you're going to have to figure this thing out. I'm going to back you up. I'm going to give you a good education and all that. But, I'm a white woman raising a black son in America. That's tough.
In the 80s.
Yeah, I think in any time.
Yeah.
I didn't know how to do that. I didn't know how to raise a child, much less a child of a different race, and America being what it is. So, I think, Black parents talk a lot about having the the talk with their kids, which the talk is about being careful out there so the police do not think you're a threat, and and understanding the assumption that people are going to assume negative about you, that in such a situation they might think you're doing something criminal when you're just minding your own business. And so I had to have the same talk with him, but I didn't have the generations worth of knowledge of how to do that. So a lot of times I'd rely on Black friends of mine to kind of coach me along and to help me with that. But I was very worried about him for that. And I mean, like I said before, my parents cut me off because I had him. So I started off with expectation that things were going to be a little rough for him. I mean, if his own grandparents didn't want to know him, they both died without ever meeting him.
That must have been really hard for you.
Oh, very painful.
Yeah.
Very and hard for him.
Yeah.
Now he's okay with it, but that's a terrible thing to tell your child.
Yeah.
And so that was our very first lesson on racism, right there in the family itself. And I didn't want him to grow up paranoid or angry either. So there was just that balance. So I'm Jewish, his father's Black. So we're talking about Jewish and Black. I remember early on saying, before I teach him about the Holocaust and anti-Semitism and racism and slavery, I want to first have him get a sense of what's positive about those two heritages and what he has going for him. Because I was so afraid of him growing up angry and paranoid.
And I love this mindset because if you think about America today, it isn't the America of 40 years ago. It is very melting pot.
Can I disagree?
Of course you can disagree.
So, the Black Lives Matter stuff basically was about that, police violence against Black men for the most part. And that's still happening today. And it was happening then. And it's still reality. It's not really a melting pot. It is true that there are more opportunities and there's good paths available, and that's what I want him to have access to. But there's also a lot of very negative paths available. So you mentioned that he was a marathon runner. He would go out running, and a lot of times he had to run at night because he was working during the day or at school. And I wanted him to wear a reflective vest, which he wouldn't do. But the reason I wanted him to wear it wasn't because of traffic. It was because of the police. I want him to be seen as a Black runner, not a Black man running.
Right.
And he wouldn't do it because he didn't look cool, of course, and kids care about looking cool more than anything. I've been in stores with him where I see the store detective following him around.
Right.
So it could still be tough out there. So you had to grow up with an understanding of that reality. But the flip side, like I said, I also wanted him to know that he had agency, that he could create his own narrative, and that I didn't want him to be paranoid or angry. Like I said, I just wanted him to be realistic and yet optimistic.
So I think we should go back to sort of your college years when you got very invested in the women's lib movement and civil rights movement, and not just watching it and debating it around a coffee table, but actually taking action.
Mm-hmm.
What was that like?
Well, I was an activist. It really started for me in college, like you said, in terms of being an activist. But I think my ethos behind all that really started in high school. That I really developed very strong values around egalitarian philosophies. And, I was fortunate, like I said, I got a really good education. But in those days, a lot of it was that women were going to be supposed to be educated in case. Like we were supposed to get married, but we should have maybe teaching credential in case it didn't work out. But my generation kind of is the one that moved that forward, where more women started working outside the home and all that kind of stuff. And so, like I said, I was blessed with an education that I could do that. Another interesting thing that I actually just learned a few years ago was, so I went to a Jewish school in Manhattan, in New York City. And it turns out, now I've learned that quite a few of our teachers actually were blacklisted during the McCarthy era and could not work in the public school system. And some of the Jewish ones got hired by some of the Jewish schools. So I realize now, looking back at that, I read some pretty progressive stuff when I was in high school.
Right.
I remember Grapes of Wrath, for instance.
Yeah.
A lot of stuff like that. And I think that some of their kind of more socialistic kind of attitudes definitely seep through into our little brain.
Yeah. Fueling you, maybe fueling you.
Yeah. And so, because at one point, I remember asking myself, how did I get,
Right.
why do I believe what I believe?
Right.
The other thing is, growing up very Jewish, like I say, I went to a Jewish school. I was born in Israel.
Right.
I was born in Jerusalem. I came to America when I was 7 years old. And I was born in 1945, which means I was born right at the end of World War II. And I grew up, as many of my friends did, with a shadow of the Holocaust over us. It had just happened. Because I went to a Jewish school, and like I said, we all born in 45, many of my classmates are children of Holocaust survivors. 3 of my classmates were born in displaced persons camps. So fear, anger, a sense of the injustice of it all was definitely a huge part of how we grew up. And transferring the anger we had about anti-Semitism and saying how unfair it is to race issues was just a very easy step.
That seems very logical.
Right. Racism's wrong. Anti-Semitism, wrong. All those isms are wrong. So I went into college, 1963.
Right.
Kennedy was assassinated when I was a freshman in college. I went to college in a border state in Maryland, and the civil rights movement was really cooking then, and there were marches and all this. And it was very natural for me to get involved. I mean, I knew what I believed. I never had to be convinced that segregation was wrong. Nobody had to convince me of that. I immediately knew that.
Yeah. And you marched at the White House, am I right about that?
Several times in my life.
So what was that like? Take us to that.
The last one was when Trump was inaugurated the first time.
Okay.
And that march I went to with my son and daughter-in-law. So that was very meaningful to me, to know that the next generation also believes in freedom and equality.
What do you get out of the marches? Like, what do you take away from being part of a march?
So in those days, again, look, it wasn't a huge step. It was almost just being with your peer group, because that's, I hung out with the people who agreed with me, and that's what everybody was doing. So I'd love to say I was, the vanguard. I wasn't. I was really believing what a lot of the people in my generation believed, and I had to end up being more on the left side of that and more the activist side of that. But it was really a generational movement. I mean, it was really an amazing time to be in your late teens and 20s and 60s. And I mean, the civil rights movement, the civil rights marches, at that time, this was before everybody became more separatist. It was a time in which Black and white people worked together for civil rights.
Yeah.
And as white people, we were welcomed to those marches,
Right.
and appreciated there. And it felt good. It felt like we were part of something very important. And, there were a lot of things. I mean, there was racism, and then I was living in New York where there were the Stonewall riots, which was gay people finally fighting back against police brutality against them. And I immediately got that, because that made sense. And it was around that same time that I first heard the words women liberation. I had never heard those words. And it's shameful, because we were not educated on the earlier waves of suffragettes and all that at that time.
Huh.
I don't remember reading much about that or hearing much about that. So I was watching TV one night. We were watching the Miss America pageant, it was. And all of a sudden, there's a commotion in the audience, as it was a demonstration, and these women unfurl a banner saying women's liberation. And that was the first time I'd ever seen those words.
And that's incredible at a pageant, which could be considered, most unlikely to have that unfurled. And there you go on national television with
Well, I was watching. I was watching on TV. Well, the idea was that the pageant was objectifying women based on their appearance and all that. And I feel actually there'd been some real progress in how those pageants are viewed over the years, but back then it was definitely like that. And so I saw those two words and I went, yeah, that's what I've been. It was like it was in the back of my mind, and it's something that had been cooking in my mind. As soon as I saw those words, I got the whole thing. The whole thing became real clear to me. Um, it's like I was like, if you'd seen it on a movie, like tick, 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 all the things. And I started looking for a group to join and people to meet. And at that time in women's liberation, we did what we called consciousness raising groups, which was really women would sit down and talk together about their experiences. And by sharing our experiences, we became empowered.
Your experiences as women.
As women, we became empowered. A lot of times we experience things in isolation, each of us living our own lives separately. Right. And then all of a sudden you hear that, oh, you went through that too. Right. And all of a sudden you're not so crazy. But then I joined a group. You're going to love this one. I'm looking for groups to join. And I met this woman and she invited me. It was called Witch. Women's International Terrorist Conspiracy from Hell.
Wow.
Women's Witch.
If that doesn't get you on some kind of a McCarthy list.
Whatever. I went to, and that's where I met quite a few women. I met Robin Morgan there. And I don't know if you know her. She's an author and a great feminist thinker. She's written quite a few books. And she was very much in the forefront of that movement. And she was, tell me what you're doing. Tell me. Right. And she was just very surprised at how much I already had figured out in my own head, and became good friends. And then I was going to go to the next women's, Miss American Pageant. The following year, I went to that demonstration, and we were trying to figure out a logo, and there's going to be a pin.
Right.
And so I was there in the room where the women's symbol with the fist.
Oh, right.
Was designed, was created by Robin Morgan's husband.
Wow.
There's a man who designed that.
And there's a moment, because who doesn't know that symbol?
I was right there. What was happening was the women, we were all sitting, talking, planning about this. And he was sort of in the corner, listening, paying attention, but not butting in at all. And he was doodling. And then he showed us what he had doodled. And we went, that's it. And that became the whole.
So you are getting heavily invested in all aspects of women's liberation, and you're talking about it, and then you decide to do what with it? How does that translate into your actions?
I'm not sure of that point. I think what was different about the women's liberation movement from other movements is most of the actions were not big, like marches. Mm-hmm. It was more on the ground, like I say, consciousness raising and working towards specific goals and actions. So the thing I really got heavily involved with, and by then I had moved to California, and I picked up a book by Suzanne Brown-Miller about rape. And again, I'm fortunate I've never been raped, right? But it's an amazing book. It's yay thick, and it really explains rape not just as, first of all, not as a crime of sex, but a crime of power, but also as in historical context, rape during war times, and how rape is used as power on very many levels. I became very upset about all that, and I decided I wanted to get involved in anti-rape work. So there was an organization called Bay Area Women Against Rape. I joined, and I became a rape crisis counselor. So what that is if a woman gets raped, she would call us. I was on an emergency call line. I could be called in the middle of the night, and most often it was the middle of the night. And I would go pick her up wherever she was and take her to the hospital and take her to the police station. And this is way before there was anything like rape kits or anything like that. So the police person that she was most likely to have to deal with would be a man.
Right.
Now it's improved somewhat.
Right.
So I'd be there as a buffer between the system and to help her through the system. And I did that for quite a few years.
So sometimes you do this kind of work and you start seeing the world through the lens of which you're working. How did it impact you?
I became very paranoid about rape, actually. And past a certain point, I finally had to stop. It made me really angry. I remember my boyfriend at the time feeling like he said, hey, I didn't do anything. I was just angry at men because I was hearing these horrible stories. And so it did affect me. But I also felt very empowered because we were making changes. So it was really Bay Area Women Against Rape working with the Berkeley Police Department to start developing some of these rape kits and, procedures, exactly what, I mean, they were very open. They wanted to, okay, how can we improve? So, and then we also had the legislative arm. So I wasn't involved in that, but they'd go to Sacramento and try and get laws. And so for me, that felt very empowering. But then past a certain point, I just couldn't do it anymore.
So, and did you have Robert by then or no?
This is before I had Robert.
So you're still having some kind of a job because you have to make a living. You're spending all your free time on causes that you believe in. And then you end up having a son. So you're also a great juggler.
Well, yeah, there was a lot going on then. But I mean, until I had the son, I had lots of time because I didn't have a kid.
Yeah.
Once I had a kid, of course, everything changed. I really had to change my priorities tremendously. It was also, I mean, before I had Robert, it was a fairly turbulent time for me in terms of relationships. I had a difficult childhood with my father. He was very authoritarian. I didn't have much freedom growing up. And like many people who grew up in an overly structured childhood, I kind of went a little crazy when I got out of there. I made a lot of bad decisions. I mean, aside from working and my political work, I was also in crazy relationships.
Right.
Things were difficult for me. I had been married, and thank goodness it wasn't a good marriage in the sense that we were not really husband and wife. We were more like brother and sister.
Yeah.
So eventually it fell apart. He's still one of my best friends.
Wow.
He really is. So I was and he was somebody who really helped me with Robert through the years. But that relationship gave me some stability. And then when that started falling apart, I lost some of my stability.
Right.
And so, I mean, having Robert came out of a very bad relationship, which I end up as a single mother. It was a stupid relationship. Actually, Robert, as an adult, said to me, this is embarrassing for a mother to hear from her kid, what were you thinking? He actually says to me, what were you thinking? And he meant to have him,
And you're like, thank God I wasn't thinking quite right.
Yeah, but what happened was once I had Robert, it was like somebody, threw cold water in my face. Hey,
Right.
Well, once I knew I was pregnant, I knew that I had to make a choice. That either I could not have this child,
Right.
or I had to get my act together.
Right.
And one of the reasons that I feel choice is so important for women is because I made a choice to have Robert. By then abortion was legal.
Right.
And I considered it. Because it was not a planned pregnancy. I considered it. And I made a conscious decision to have this child. And therefore, I knew that it was my responsibility to put aside some of my immediate desires and immediate gratification for him. He didn't ask me born, so now he became the most important thing.
Right.
And I grew up a lot in that first year.
No, makes sense. So let's go back to your childhood for a second. So you have a very authoritative father figure, and we know how important the early years are and how you're influenced by that. Did you make a conscious decision to raise Robert very differently in terms of
Yeah, well, my parents came from the world where kids were just supposed to do what they're told. And I don't mean just in the moment when they're children, but to live their lives that way. That I remember telling my parents, look, I want to live my own life. And they literally did not understand the words I was saying.
Right.
Because they didn't grow up that way.
Right.
And so I raised Robert with that whole different philosophy. Like I say, that he didn't ask me born.
Right.
And he has to make his own path in the world. And obviously I'm there to guide him. Like I said, I was a tough love mom. I was not an overly permissive mother at all.
Resiliency was huge, it sounds like. So let's talk about today's kids. So today's kids, a lot of them are growing up, very advantaged because we've all worked so hard.
Yeah.
And, I think we're starting to worry about that. What would you say to parents that don't have a child with fire in the belly or who, are not going out and hungry for things? What would you say to those parents?
Well, like I said, I believe in tough love. By the way, I was a tough love teacher, and I've managed a lot of people in my life, and I was a manager. Same there. It's like really there's no time or space for belly aching on this planet. It's just too tough out there. And if you can explain to me, I can give you lots of examples of people who don't have what you have. So um, I like the way my son and daughter are raising their kids, because even though, of course, they're much more advantaged than either of them were. My daughter also grew up fairly much more disadvantaged than Robert did. They What they're telling their kids is, yeah, we're here to help you, but you're going to have to make your own path.
Right.
And it's like, you're living in our house, you're going to have to get your own house someday.
Right.
That kind of thing. Um, I like that even though it's New York and a lot of parents tend to be overprotective, that they are teaching the kids to be street savvy and letting them get out there and as soon as possible to do different, walk the dog by themselves.
So they're not helicoptering around.
They're really not.
Yeah.
They're really not. And I really agree with that.
Yeah.
And I think that, like I think all of us nowadays, we really worry about all the screen time everybody's on. And one thing I knew that when my son got a little bit older, you are the center of your kid's universe up until a certain point.
Right.
And then overnight you are not.
Right.
And you don't know when it's going to happen. All of a sudden it's gone. All of a sudden your son doesn't want to be hugged anymore. All those things happen, and their peer group become the expert on everything. And you know that their peer group's stupid and they don't know everything, but there's not much you can do about that because they're going to be influenced by them. So one of the things I was careful with Robert is I actually control what kind of peer group you can have by choosing where he went to school, that kind of stuff. I actually pulled him out of a school because I didn't like the kids he was hanging out with at a certain point. I think that from my grandkids, it's the exact opposite, that the kids that they're hanging out with are too sheltered and don't have any problem, that kind of thing. And so, what do they talk about? What are they thinking about?
Right.
And, we had a lot that we were pushing against when I was growing up, and so did Robert, the unfairness we saw in the world and all that. I don't know. I mean, I don't want my grandkids to suffer that they build resilience.
No, but it sounds like you're thinking about the context that each child is placed in and how you can help that child be effective in their community and the greater world.
I feel, sometimes it's just really simple things like giving your kids chores.
Yeah.
And them not feeling that they just get allowance because they're cute, but, do something to earn it.
Right.
I'm happy when I see, they're little still, getting up from the table, bringing their plates in, rinsing up, putting the dishwasher. These are, on the one hand, small things, but they're not small.
No.
Because if you raise your kids to understand they have to participate, they have to help, that they're part of a community, their family is a community, their school is a community, that you have to do your part, you have to earn your place.
Right.
I think that goes a long way.
And what's that saying? In the little things are built the bigger things.
Yeah.
Right?
Exactly. I think that what's facing a lot of our young kids today are such big, overwhelming global forces that they feel powerless to fight against. Somehow I think my generation was blessed with the ignorance that we thought that we could change things that probably we couldn't have changed, but we did it anyway.
There was like an optimism or a belief.
I don't know if it was optimism so much as no, we weren't told we couldn't, that the world wouldn't change. I believe that every generation faces its own Holocaust, its own pandemic. And I remember when I was quite young talking to my mother, because at that time we were afraid of nuclear war. That was the big fear in the 50s. and we were having this dumb things where we'd go under the desk for a nuclear
Yeah, I remember.
ray. And I said to my mother, I remember exactly where I was standing, and she and I were talking about, and I was basically saying to her, "Is the world coming to an end? Is this, you know?" And she said something very wise to me. And she said, "Every generation thinks that. Every generation thinks the world's coming to an end." And she said, "What do you think we thought about the Holocaust?"
Mm-hmm.
You know, and that's given me some perspective, because even now, sometimes I feel that way. I mean, so much
Yeah.
problematic is going on that you think, are we going, like global warming, whatever, are we going to survive? But one way or another, we keep going.
So what do you do with that personally? So you keep the joy or whatever it is, it keeps you going every day and you don't get overwhelmed? Because I think you're right. There's a lot of depression going on. People feel isolated. What do you
And a
personally
lot of
do?
anxiety.
Right.
So I'd like to say that I've got this solved. I don't. I do have some philosophies that get me through things, which is, it's funny because I'm not a religious person, but some of what I believe come from different religions. And in Judaism, there's a saying that it's not for us to finish the job; it's for us to do our part of it. So the universe has a big crack in it. I mean, there's a lot of problems, and this is, again, it's not from today. These are words that were written many hundreds of years ago. But that, not to feel that because I cannot solve the whole world's problems, that I shouldn't do anything. So what can I do? I can be kind to you.
Right.
That, yes, go ahead and give charity to that person. It may not solve all their problems, but it might give them some food today. And there's something good about that. And yes, there's a huge amount of hate in the world. I cannot eradicate that hate, but I can work on my own hatred, and I can show as much love as possible where I sit.
Right.
Because I think that the feeling of powerlessness that leads to paralysis and to not doing anything, I think that's the problem. Because there's always something you can do.
Right.
There's always something you can do. And that comes back to what I always say, when I have problems, I go think. There's always something that
Yeah.
there's, in the 12-step program, they say there's no problem so big that can't be made better.
Right.
Where we get into the thing of things are so bad that I can't get out of this hole, but you can a little bit. Maybe you can't get all the way out, so to take that first step. And I think that's one of the things I taught Robert as a kid. Just find what you can do. Don't talk about what you can't do. You and I both in the real estate business, and how many times do you hear other agents complain they're not making any money?
Yeah.
And you'll give them a suggestion.
Yeah.
Oh, no, I can't do that.
Exactly.
And you give and they give you another reason why they can't do that. Because you could always find a million reasons for why you cannot do something
Right.
positive. Just find that one reason why you can and do something.
So you also mentioned something that I think might connect to this. Doing something, but you also said the word kindness. And I know that Robert's built this compass based on kindness. He has been known to let somebody go who was very good because they were not kind to a secretary. That is in the ethos. And being one of the first agents in the Greenwich office, I remember he cared about production. But the first 6 agents, they had to have integrity and kindness. So I think kindness seems like that's something that's important to you, and certainly you see in him.
Well, I want to tell you a story about that, actually. So when Robert was first starting Compass, I was already a real estate agent. I'd been a real estate agent for decades before he decided to start Compass. And I gave him a lot of advice, some of which he listened to, some of which he didn't. He certainly accomplished much more than I would have thought up. So anyway, it was early in Compass, and he needed to recruit agents in New York City. At this point, he was just in New York. And he didn't know agents in New York City, but I did. So I said, look, I can help you recruit. Who are you looking for? What kind of people are you looking for? Who should I introduce you to? And I expect him to talk about markets that he was trying to hit or production levels.
Yeah.
That's not what he said to me. He said to me, I really just want to hire nice people. And then he added the word kind. I want to hire nice and kind people. So I look at him like I have birthed myself a crazy man. because he wants to start a real estate company in New York City
Yeah.
based on kindness and niceness. That dog-eat-dog world of real estate. I was like, you sure about? He said, yeah, that's what I want. And a lot of it came from other places he'd worked, and he didn't want that. He wanted a wonderful place for people to work. So that's what he's done. And it is remarkable to me that now that we have over 30,000 agents
Right.
nationwide, you can still walk into a Compass a Compass office and meet agents that are kind
Right.
and nice and helpful to each other. And you're right. I've seen Robert fire people that high production people. I mean, would cost money to fire them because they were not nice and they didn't treat staff. I mean, a secretary that could have been easily replaced, her mistreating her became more important than a huge producer.
Right.
And when I saw that, I went, okay.
Okay, so we have to talk about one huge kindness that I think you're now doing, and I almost want to say the grand gesture. Let's talk about Compass Plus.
Compass Plus.
Tell us about Compass Plus.
So Compass Plus is my last baby, I think. Okay, so Compass Plus is a division that we're starting, and I'm co-founder at Compass, dedicated to assisting older adults in transition. What do I mean by that? Most older adult seniors are living in homes that they will not be able to stay in as they age, either because the homes are too big or there's a lot of stairs.
Well,
Quite often it's because they live in areas where they would have to drive to have some independence, and they, after a certain age, it's just not safe to drive anymore. So they have to move. And they might be downsizing, they might be moving in with family. Maybe many seniors are moving into assisted living communities. And so the sale of their previous home is what they're going to need to use to fund that next step, because that next step is usually fairly expensive.
right.
So that's what we want to help with. We feel that it's such a difficult and important part of a senior's life. And I believe that, I think we all know this, that seniors are not treated as well as they should be in our world. And that it runs the gamut from just impatience with us because we may need more time,
Yeah.
to abuse and scamming.
Right.
And when it comes to real estate transactions, that can be very serious.
Right.
So we wanted to create, a group, a division of agents that would operate at the highest possible ethical and professional level in these transactions. So we require all Compass Plus agents to become certified senior advisors. This is a designation you get through the Society of Certified Senior Advisors. And it's not a little thing. It's a big course and a test that you have to take. And
this almost seems like another cause for you, like all the other.
yeah, it is. It is.
And what I like is I saw one thing on social media and you come right out and you say, this is not sexy work. This is not work that is going to make you a lot of money.
No.
This is important work. And I think that's a lot of what your life has been about.
It is very important. You're right. It's not the luxury division. Compass has a luxury division. We have a sports and entertainment division. It's not any of that. It's not glamorous. It's also very slow moving work, because you cannot do right by a senior and be impatient.
Right.
You're talking to somebody who's lived decades in this home. They're going to have to move. They're going to have to sell it. There's a lot of resistance. There's a lot of fear.
Right.
A lot of denial.
Right.
So you have to be patient for that. One of the things I tell people is I don't want anybody joining Compass Plus who's in their first couple of years in the business, because I want them to have another flow of income. I don't want them to worry that if this senior doesn't sell their house this month, then I can't pay my rent.
Yeah.
It's and so, like, what I like to say is you have to have a heart for this.
Yeah.
You have to really care about the people you're dealing with. And, my motto is mission before commission. That the mission is to help the people. The commission will follow. I'm not saying no commission.
Right.
Because we do want to earn a living and we should earn a living. But that shouldn't be the animating force in the morning to, how can I move this person out of their house?
So this has been a fascinating conversation. I've got one last question for you. If you had to sum up your life in what was your mission or what is your mission, what would you say?
My whole life, I'd say social justice.
Yeah.
I think social justice, which I mean both in a macro and a micro sense, for me to act justly to people and for me to participate in the world moving more in that direction.
And it's unique to see someone who has put aside a lot of things they could have done to reach out to help others who didn't. And it really touches me because you don't see it that much.
Well, thank you for saying that. I'm going to be turning 80 this year, and I do see Compass Plus as my legacy project. It's probably as you mentioned before, I've done a lot of things. This is probably my last big project. Um, and then one after that is for me to move into assisted living, which, by the way, I'm not dreading anymore. I'm kind of looking forward to aging well. Um, but I do look back on my life, and I feel I have left some legacies.
Yeah.
Kids I taught that grew up well, my son, things I fought for. And, you do look back at this age a lot, and I can find a lot of things I did wrong, a lot of mistakes, but all in all, not so bad. Not
Yeah.
so bad.
Thank you, Ruth. And I think you've just seen why Ruth is one of the most incredible women I've ever met. So thank you.
Thank you.